When inflation continues to rage out of control, the Biden administration continues to say that everything is going to be hunky-dory. By most economists' estimates, it's going to be well into next year before inflation really starts to hit the rates that Americans are used to, namely that 2% that the Federal Reserve aims for. As we know, the Biden administration has blamed everybody except themselves for all of this. But here is the thing. The inflation is part of the theory the Democrats embraced. They embraced all of the fiscal and economic prerequisites for inflation. The definition of inflation is too many dollars following too few goods. When you jack up government spending, when you recommend that the Federal Reserve pursue easy monetary policy, the predictable result of this is that you end up with inflation. Unless we believe that this is some sort of like random thing that just happened to Democrats. No, it isn't. This has been embedded in their most cherished ideals for a very long time. One of the weird things about Joe Biden's presidency is that he was nominated based on the fact that he was not Bernie Sanders and that he was not Elizabeth Warren. And then once he became president, he decided to pursue exactly the same policies that Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren would have pursued. And so to understand what's happening right now, you sort of have to understand what Bernie and Elizabeth Warren were saying way back in the day, meaning like 2019, 2020. So I want to take you in the time machine back to June 12th, 2019, when Bernie Sanders gave a big speech about democratic socialism, which sounds a lot like Build Back Better. If you listen to what he actually says the government ought to do, it sounds exactly like Build Back Better. So here is Bernie Sanders circa June 2019. This is a major policy speech. The media ate it up. It was covered with sterling recommendations by Vox and the New York Times. Here was Bernie announcing what democratic socialism really meant.
We must take the next step forward and guarantee every man, woman, and child in our country basic economic rights, the right to quality health care. The right to as much education as one needs to succeed in our society. The right to a good job that pays a living wage. The right to affordable housing. The right to a secure retirement. And the right to live in a clean environment. And that is what I mean by democratic socialism.
The right to have a unicorn that craps gold. The right to have one type of pudding. It's not very good, but we'll have a lot of it. The right to stand in the bread line. Many things. It'll be unbelievable. And the crowd goes wild. Well, the question, of course, is how you pay for all of these magical rights. Well, first of all, you have to force people to do things they don't want to do, because if you have a right to a service from someone else, they now have a duty to provide you that service. So that is problem number one. But from a fiscal point of view, the answer is somebody has to pay for it. So you're either going to have to radically raise taxes, which is something that Bernie Sanders has indeed proposed, or you're going to have to print an enormous amount of money. And it is no shock that The New Yorker ran a piece, August 2019, titled, "The Economist Who Believes the Government Should Just Print More Money." Stephanie Kelton, a senior economic advisor to Bernie Sanders and professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook University, is popular in a way that economists almost definitionally are not. Filmmakers trail her with cameras. She goes on international speaking tours and once sold out a basketball arena in Italy. Kelton is the foremost evangelist of a fringe economic movement called modern monetary theory, which argues in part that the government should pay for programs requiring big spending, like the Green New Deal, simply by printing more money. This is a polarizing idea. This spring, Kelton spoke at the Wall Street Journal's Future of Everything Festival. On the dais, a Journal staffer introduced Kelton as an economist with an idea that will either solve the world's problems or send it into ruin. She made a face and then walked on stage. So what exactly does she say? Well, adherents of MMT imagine a world built on MMT principles in which the government provides guaranteed jobs, healthcare, affordable college, launches clean infrastructure projects to replace crumbling highways, airports, and bridges. Kelton, who does at least 5 interviews per week, plus lectures, speaking gigs, and conferences, is, more than anyone else, responsible for building MMT's digital army. So what exactly is MMT? Well, it means that we just spend money and don't worry about it. Okay, so Kelton hears a lot of concerns about MMT. The basic idea of modern monetary theory is we spend a lot of money. People continue to buy our bonds because we're still the best bet on the block. And until that ain't true anymore, we can just continue to spend money and there will be no effect on inflation. So according to The New Yorker, again, August of 2019, she is the chief economic advisor to Bernie Sanders. Quote,
Kelton often hears the same concerns about MMT. Most are about inflation. How soon will we become Zimbabwe, which printed so many Zimbabwean dollars that inflation peaked in 2008 at an annual rate of 96 trillion %? Never, according to Kelton. Under MMT, the focus is sustainable inflation, whereas fiscal traditionalists worry about the deficit and don't consider inflation at all. Doesn't MMT then require accurate forecasting of inflation risk? Yes, and Kelton conceded at the festival the models aren't perfect, but we can do a pretty good job. Anyway, government spending, she believes, is responsible for just a small part of inflation. Kelton believes that MMT is a new framework, but is founded on old ideas buried and forgotten in the work of foundational economists. Okay, so she was pushing the idea that you could just basically spend money, no problem. This is, again, 2019, quote, "The current economic conditions look pretty good for MMT. In Japan, where deficits are high and the interest rate is set at less than zero, the economy is met with no calamity. When Congress passed a tax cut in 2017, the CBO predicted there would be a jump in interest rates caused by the deficit. This has not happened. Still, most mainstream economists view MMT as the cult of the magic money tree." Okay, well, even Paul Krugman had thought this was a bad idea, but most Democrats had started to kind of circulate around these ideas. Elizabeth Warren, who was sort of a warmed-over Bernie Sanders devotee, she gave a speech in December of 2019 at a college called St. Anselm. And she said a couple of things. One, she said the same stuff that Bernie said. We should spend an awful lot of money. Here was Elizabeth Warren circa December 2019.
Reagan had it wrong. Our problem isn't big government. Our problem is a government that has been captured by the rich and the powerful. Government could help grow the economy, could create opportunities, could support small businesses and entrepreneurship. But instead, we have a government that works only for those at the top. Reagan liked to talk about freedom, but real freedom isn't living under the thumb of a handful of billionaires and giant corporations. Real freedom isn't living deep in debt, one health scare or one broken transmission away from disaster. Real freedom isn't watching while more and more opportunities get snatched up by the rich and powerful. Real freedom comes when a strong government enforces fair rules and when smart investments give every American the opportunity to prosper.
But here's the thing. Elizabeth Warren didn't just stop with the warmed-over Bernie Sanders rhetoric. She then talked about what you need to do at the Federal Reserve. So the idea was easy money was going to make all of this possible. You just blow out the Federal Reserve's grabbing of assets on the open market, inject more money into the economy. This will make magic happen. Here was Elizabeth Warren again. This is December 12th, 2019, approximately 4 months before the economy completely cratered and about a year and a half before inflation became a serious issue. Here's Elizabeth Warren.
We will appoint a Federal Reserve Board that believes in full employment, that recognizes that inflation fears have been overblown for years, and someone who is willing to let wages grow.
That's unbelievable. That clip is unbelievable. We have Elizabeth Warren, December 2019. We need Federal Reserve members. We're going to explode the spending. We're going to recognize that we don't have to worry about inflation. Who cares about inflation? And who will let wages grow? Okay, well, the wages have actually declined because of the inflationary policy of the Federal Reserve. That was Elizabeth Warren, the great plan person. Remember this? And she was running. I know we've all forgotten about it. We've blocked it out from our memories that Elizabeth Warren was ever a viable candidate. But there was a point where she was actually leading that race. And then everybody realized that she was a charmless hack, just like Kamala Harris. And then she fell apart. But for a moment there, she was the media's beloved candidate. They loved her. She was the one with the plan. She had a plan for that. Her plan was exactly the plan that brought about inflation. So Joe Biden enters office. And was after spending the campaign not being Bernie and not being Elizabeth Warren. And he immediately rams through this quote-unquote COVID relief bill. Now, as you remember, this passed in March of 2021. You'll remember that by this point, the vaccines were already being trenched out en masse. So we were coming to the end of COVID, and everyone knew it. It was already going to be that everybody who wanted a vax could get a vax. This is true by essentially April of 2021. And he was bashing through with no Republican support, none. So these are all Democrats who own this. He was bashing through $1.9 trillion in COVID spending. And in the process, not shockingly, he was praising Bernie Sanders, right? Bernie, whose policies these are all based on. This is what happens when you let a socialist run the party. So here's Biden praising Bernie as he passed a $1.9 trillion quote unquote stimulus plan that merely stimulated inflation.
I promised the American people, and I guess it's becoming an overused phrase, that help was on the way. But today, with the American Rescue Plan now signed into law, we've delivered on that promise. And I don't mean I've delivered, we've delivered. And I want to say to Bernie, stepping up and making the case why this was so transformational made a big difference in how a lot of people voted.
And then, of course, Nancy Pelosi came out and declared the COVID relief bill a triumph. Here was the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Let me say this about my members. Our chairs were dazzling in their own work, intellect, integrity, imagination for the American people, working with their Senate colleagues. I say their beautiful diversity of our members. And I say to them, our diversity is our strength. Our unity is our power. And in this bill, our diversity to protect everyone in our country, to end the disparity in access to everything that the bill presents. Our diversity was reflected in the House and the Senate in that policy. But our unity on behalf of all of the American people is what made this such a triumph.
Okay, you own it. You own it. This is all Democrats. There's Nancy Pelosi with the Bane mask on. And she's done amazing, amazing stuff. Okay, then Joe Biden went around and he trotted around talking about the magic of the American Rescue Plan. And he talked about how much money he was spending. This was the key component, was how much money he was spending. So he talked about how it was going to generate economic growth for the entire, massive economic growth. It was going to raise wages. It was going to rebuild the backbone of the economy. Here was Joe Biden, again, praising the $1.9 trillion plan that was completely unnecessary. The economy was already in a state of recovery. Here was Joe Biden.
It will generate economic growth for the entire nation. That's why major economists, left, right, and center, support this plan. Even Wall Street has agreed. According to Moody's, by the end of this year, this law will spur our economy to create 7 million new jobs. And it does one more thing. It focuses on rebuilding the backbone of this country. Working families, the middle class, people who built this country.
And then he said, you know what's going to be a big part of this? Sending 100 million checks or direct deposits. You know what that's called? That's called helicopter money. That is inflation. Okay, so the basic rule about inflation is that if we live in a town and there are only a certain number of goods and a helicopter arrives at all the houses and just drops $100,000 in everybody's backyard, is everybody rich now? No. The prices of those limited goods just reflect the fact that everybody now has $100,000 in their pocket. That's all. But that's exactly what Joe Biden was praising, was the helicopter cash. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren monetary policy right here.
100 million checks going into the pockets and or direct deposits, going into the pockets of Americans on the way to millions of more Americans. That's real progress.
By real progress, he means that wages were about to decline significantly over the course of the next year. Okay, so fast forward to like May of 2021. Had they started to pick up on the fact that inflation had already picked up? Nah. Elizabeth Warren was still out there saying, we need more spending. This is nothing, guys. We need our $3 trillion bill back. Maybe more than that. Maybe 7, 8 trillion. Who knows? There's no limit. After all, modern monetary theory says you keep spending until there ain't no spending to be done. Here's Elizabeth Warren circa May 2021.
Senator Capito has introduced a bill that's about, I think, $500 or $600 billion. Biden's transportation infrastructure bill is about $2 trillion. Mm-hmm. Would you be opposed to any sort of compromise in between? Well, $800 billion, $900 billion?
I'm not going to start by negotiating against myself, but understand this. What it's going to take to repair the roads and bridges in America, what it's going to take to make sure that not just part of America has access to broadband, but all of America has access to broadband, and what it's going to take to make sure that we have universal child care that is affordable, available, and high quality all across this nation. That is a big ticket item. And we've got to make sure that we put enough resources in to make that happen. I think that the president's budget, quite frankly, doesn't go quite far enough.
The budget doesn't go quite far enough. It doesn't go far enough. The president, by the way, had proposed a $6 trillion budget. But it didn't go far enough. Okay, literally the next day, the questions are already happening. This is in May of 2021, well over a year ago. And the inflation already started to set in. So Jen Psaki, who was then the press secretary for the White House, she was asked about inflation. She's like, oh, it's transitory, no big deal.
The Federal Reserve, I would point you to them to speak to or provide analysis or speculation on anything as it relates to inflation or the impact of certain external actions. I will say, as we've said in here before, but we'll reiterate that, of course, we take the possibility of inflation quite seriously. As you know, actions that have been taken to date or proposals that have been made, most economic analysts believe that it will have a temporary or transitory impact. But in terms of analysis on current events, I would point you to the Federal Reserve.
Transitory, very transitory. Okay, by July, Joe Biden was still saying that it was transitory. This is July 19th, 2021.
As our economy has come roaring back, we've seen some price increases. Some folks have raised worries that this could be a sign of persistent inflation. But that's not our view.
Oh.
Our experts believe, and the data shows, that most of the price increases we've seen were expected and are expected to be temporary. Reality is you can't flip the global economic light back on and not expect this to happen. As demand returns, there's going to be global supply chain challenges. We've seen that in semiconductors, which are used in automobiles. That global shortage has slowed vehicle production, creating a temporary spike in car prices. That's a real challenge. My administration will do everything we can to address it.
It's transitory, though.
But again, these disruptions are temporary.
Temporary, transitory, temporary, transitory. September 27, 2021. Fed officials say that the transitory inflation may last quite a while. According to the Wall Street Journal, quote, all year the Federal Reserve's messaging on inflation has been consistent. This year's surge is transitory. Inflation will soon return close to the central bank's 2% target. Yet, look more closely, and it is clear officials are turning less sanguine, and that explains growing eagerness to start raising interest rates. Last September, long before supply bottlenecks emerged, the median forecast by the Fed was for core inflation in 2022 of 1.8%. Every few months since that, they've nudged it up. The forecast released, again, this is September of 2021, they saw core inflation next year at 2.3%. Right now, core inflation annually in the United States is probably going to be closer to 5 or 6%. So they just happen to be off by, everything. And by the way, they wouldn't let go of it. October 6, 2021, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who had also helped preside over the Federal Reserve before she was Treasury Secretary under Joe Biden, she said inflation was transitory. This is October 2021.
We're almost 6 million jobs short of where we were before the pandemic, which means a lot of people who still need jobs. On the other hand, many firms are finding it difficult to hire. We've had extraordinary shifts in the pattern of demand away from services and toward goods. And I know the Fed is trying to sort through the implications of that. Supply bottlenecks have developed that have caused inflation. I believe that they're transitory, but that doesn't mean they'll go away over the next several months.
It's transitory. Okay, so by November 2021, Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, who never should have been reappointed for his position, by the way, he admits that he got the inflation wrong and that they blew it. So while but they didn't blow it because they thought that inflation wouldn't jump. They blew it because they had an actual economic dedication to the idea that more spending and loose monetary policy are goods. These are good. They're effectively a way to reach the democratic socialist ideal. Here is Jerome Powell admitting he got inflation wrong in November 2021. And here's where the worm really starts to turn, because it's kind of amazing that this administration, they could claim it was transitory and we got it, it'll be okay. But once it became clear that it wasn't okay, that's when you expect them to take their foot off the pedal, right? Wrong. They decide that they're going to ram their foot through the pedal. Their feet are now on the ground like Fred Flintstone. It's amazing. So here's November 2021, Jerome Powell now acknowledging that he got it wrong. Here he is.
I think it's fair to say that the experts who have been advising you about the future rate of inflation have pretty much the same credibility as those late-night psychic hotlines you see on TV.
So I think what we missed about inflation was we didn't predict the supply side problems, and those are highly unusual and very difficult, very nonlinear, and it's really hard to predict those things. But that's really what we missed, and that's why all of the professional forecasters had much lower inflation projections.
Okay, but everybody recognized by the end of 2021 that inflation was now persistent, that it wasn't transitory anymore. And yet in March of 2022, Joe Biden then proposed a $5.8 trillion budget. $5.8 trillion, including massively higher taxes on corporations and the wealthiest Americans. So a recipe for stagflation. Because again, this is part of the Bernie Sanders agenda, it is part of the Elizabeth Warren agenda, it is part of the Joe Biden agenda, it is part of the Democratic agenda writ large. More spending, more regulations, more taxation, more Federal Reserve loose monetary policy. And then you wonder why inflation happened? How's this for a title? Ben Shapiro Show subscriber destroys like button with clicks and logic. I'd watch that. Make it happen, gang.